Good day, students and learners. You're welcome to Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. Today, I'll be taking you through a topic in economics, which is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Before now, we have learned about what utility is, which essentially talks about the satisfaction that we derive by consuming commodities. We have seen that utility hypothetically can be measured, can be determined in concrete terms. We have seen the different concepts of utility, the concepts of total utility, average utility, marginal utility. We have been able to calculate and work on a utility schedule. We understood that total utility can be additive and that average utility therefore can be determined by dividing total utility by the number or the quantity of the commodity consumed. And we also saw that marginal utility is simply the change in total utility that arises as a result of the change in quantity consumed. Therefore, giving marginal utility as change in total utility divided by change in quantity. Today we'll look at the interplay of the different utility concepts that gave rise to a law which is referred to as the law of diminishing marginal utility. So come with me. So at the end of this session, you will explain the law of diminishing marginal utility. 2, you'll be able to explain the relationships of the different concepts, the relationships of the different concepts of utility. And 3, we will delve into how the law of diminishing marginal utility explains consumer equilibrium, and then we'll talk about that in more detail at a later session. So, explain consumer equilibrium. Before we look at the law itself, let's look at 2 basic concepts referred to as the point of origin and the point of saturation. The point of origin is basically the minimum amount of a product or commodity that is to be consumed or that a consumer uses before he starts to derive satisfaction. While the point of saturation is that point where the consumer gets to and has the highest satisfaction, beyond which further consumption of the commodity begins to give dissatisfaction. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that as more and more units of a commodity is consumed and as you derive more and more satisfaction, the additional unit that you consume begins to give satisfaction at a diminishing rate. Meaning that if I am to consume 10 apples, the satisfaction I get when I consume the first one is not the same as the satisfaction that I get when I consume the second one. Will not be the same satisfaction I will derive by the time I'm consuming the 5th, the 6th, and the 9th one. But beyond that, it states that the increase in satisfaction that I get by consuming more and more units will be at a diminishing rate. Meaning that if, for example, I derive 3 utils by the time I'm consuming 4 apples and derive 6 units by the time I'm consuming 5 apples, the increase from 4 to 5 is 1. By the time I'm consuming the 6th one, the law of diminishing marginal utility states that the satisfaction I will get will be less than 1, and so on. Okay? So the law in context states that diminishing marginal utility states that as more and more units of a commodity is consumed at a given period, total utility increases at a diminishing rate. So, what I just explained is that if we have a table of total utility and quantity, and the quantities are 1, 2, 3, 4, and total utility where at the consumption of 1 is 5. Total utility at the consumption of 2 is 6. Sorry, that should be, let me change that for the purpose of explanation. The total utility when you consume 2 is 10. Total utility, that's to say that total utility increases from 5 to 10. By the time I'm consuming 3, total utility could be 13. By the time I'm consuming the 4th one, total utility could be 14. So, the increase in total utility, as you see, is at a diminishing rate. The increase here is 5, here it is 3, here it is 1, and so on. And that is what, essentially, that is what the law of diminishing marginal utility is saying. In explaining this law, we typically use the drinking of water. And that is what that diagram is trying to explain. That when you start to drink water, you drink it at a faster rate than after a period, after you have taken some quantity of that water. So if you are taking a glass of water, the rate at which you drink it at the beginning is faster than by the time you are about to finish drinking that cup of water. This simply implies that the satisfaction or the pleasure that you derived when you started drinking the water reduces as you consume more and more of the water. Note too that in economics, because it is a behavioral science, it is not exact. Therefore, we state that when we postulate these laws, they are postulated considering that all other external factors are constant, they don't change, because there can be certain factors that will affect this law such that it will not hold, and then would say, oh, that law doesn't hold. No, that's not the case, because it is subject to behavior. We state that other things remain constant, especially the consumption of other goods. So, like I explained, this is what happens when you have the law, when you are trying to explain the law of diminishing marginal utility. So from this schedule here, we are able to bring out this table of total utility, which is increasing but at a diminishing rate. How do we know that? The slope at this first portion, note that the steeper the slope, the higher the rate. So the slope at this first portion, this portion here, at this first portion is steeper. Here, the steepness of the slope reduces. It becomes a bit more flat or a little more gentle, and then here it's almost flat, and then it begins to fall. Okay, and then the marginal utility itself begins to fall and consistently falls until it becomes negative. So, meaning that, note that marginal utility is what the utility you derive as you consume additional units. And we are saying the law of diminishing marginal utility is stating that the rate of utility or satisfaction that you get is increasing at a diminishing rate. So it's falling like that. So what do we observe? We observe that when marginal utility is positive, what does that mean? Now let's go to a number line. When we say marginal utility is positive, it means it is greater than 0. So if you use a number line, let me put a number line here, where you have 0. Okay. To the right, you have positive numbers. And to the left, you have negative numbers. So we can have 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And to the left, you have -1, -2, -3, and so on. So when you say positive, we mean greater. The language can also be greater than 0. It may say when marginal utility is greater than 0. Okay? When it is greater than 0, it is positive. Total utility is rising. So when your marginal utility is greater than 0 is positive, your total utility is rising. Secondly, when your marginal utility is 0, when it's exactly 0, your total utility is at its highest. Beyond that, it begins to fall. And that is illustrated graphically here. So if we compared this graph of marginal utility to that of the total utility, we would notice that for the whole of this portion, let me highlight. When marginal utility is 0, here, total utility is at its highest. And beyond that, that is when it is negative, total utility begins to fall. And if we compared the two graphs of total utility and marginal utility, we would see that the first rule, saying that when it is greater than 0 or when it is positive, in the whole of this portion, up until this point, this is where marginal utility is 0. So if we trace it up to this point, this is where it gets to. So let's call this point A. For the portion of the marginal utility up until when it gets to 0, our total utility is rising. It's continuously increasing until it gets to point A, where it reaches its maximum. And it is at that point that our marginal utility is equal to 0, because it is now on the 0 line. Beyond that, our marginal utility becomes negative, that is less than 0. And from that point, our total utility, as you can see here, begins to fall. Therefore, we conclude that the law of diminishing marginal utility holds true, all other things being equal. For the law of diminishing marginal utility to actually be explained like we have done, certain assumptions were made, some of which we have talked about in the course of this class. So, other assumptions include the fact that it is measurable. We have talked about that in utils. It's quantitative. It is the quality of the commodity doesn't change. So our consumption pattern, or the rate at which we consume, the number or the amount that we consume, is not influenced by the quality of the product. That is what this is saying. We also assume that the consumption does not proceed at intervals, meaning that I don't drink a cup of water now that I'm very thirsty, go away, and then come back when I'm thirsty again, and then say I'm trying to understand the law of diminishing marginal utility. No, it doesn't work like that. The assumption is that consumption should not proceed at intervals. Consumption should be a rational person. A rational person is someone who can make the right decisions, can take the right decisions at any point in time. And then it is also assumed that the time period is not too long. That is also related to consumption should not proceed at intervals, which means that the time period for consumption during which we try to analyze the law of diminishing marginal utility is within a short period. And then the price of the substitutes and complementary products to that commodity we are talking about do not change, because when this happens, they would influence the pattern or the quantity of consumption of the commodity. A substitute is another product you can use that you can consume in place of one. So if, for example, I can eat bread, and then I decide that instead of bread, I want to eat gari, the price of gari changing may influence the amount or the quantity of bread that I consume. So these are the assumptions, and then there are some exceptions to the law of marginal utility. There are cases where the law of diminishing marginal utility may not hold, and which cases are these? We have a case of a miser or someone who accumulates wealth. For these ones, it doesn't matter. The law of diminishing marginal utility will not hold, because their satisfaction is not subject, it's not a function of rational thinking. Okay? Someone who's just hoarding materials for the sake of it. It's the quantity that they consume or they tend to hold is not influenced by price, is not influenced by price or their income. So for this case, we can say there's an exception to the law of diminishing marginal utility. A collector of rare articles like paintings, stamps, and so on. People like this it's not rational behavior when you collect this. When I say rational, I'm not saying it's not right decision, but it's not subject to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Also, when it comes to a recital, you go to an opera, for example, you want to go and watch an opera. So this is not the amount or the length of time or the number of times you want to go may not be subject to the law of diminishing marginal utility. And then finally, no changes in taste, habits, custom, fashion, and income of the consumer to affect the consumption pattern.
Acing your WAEC and NECO examinations has been made easy by the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education with the Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO Candidates television program. Join seasoned teachers as they take you through these core subjects, targeting the exact syllabus of WAEC and NECO. Watch Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates through these social media platforms to access more educational content and give their feedback. Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. Pass your examinations with flying colors.
So at the end of this session, I believe we can now clearly explain what is meant by the law of diminishing marginal utility and be able to put together the concepts of total utility and marginal utility and the connections, the correlations between them, the relationship between them with respect to the law. Thank you for listening. If you have suggestions, observations, or any feedback, you can reach us on our social media handles that will be displayed on the screen. Thank you.